So as long as you understand that first principle sequencing of how to move yourself through these exercises, any sort of med ball slam is going to make sense. It's just a slight variation on what you're doing with your body. Mechanically, it's exactly the same. So today we're going over med ball slams and what I like to call first principles of med ball slams. These are the things that you should do on any sort of med ball slam, whether it be directly down in front of you, standing on a BOSU, like laterally throwing over the top, whatever it might be. These mechanics kind of stay the same. So as long as you understand these principles, any other sort of med ball slam movement, whatever variation you might be talking about, it'll all kind of make sense and you'll be moving the right way. The med ball slam is basically going to act as a vehicle to teach any sort of compound movement. So generally speaking, if you understand how to do this and understand the sequencing, any sort of compound movement will sort of make sense intuitively if you just apply the same principles. So before I demonstrate any sort of movement, it's important to understand what sequencing is. Sequencing in lifting is basically the same exact thing as syntax to literature. So the order of the words in a sentence, it makes a difference. Like the dog bit Johnny, Johnny bit the dog. The words are the same, but if you move the order around, it's a very different meaning to that sentence. So it's the same exact thing in fitness. The sequencing matters, the syntax matters of how you're moving. So when you're going through an exercise, it matters which joints you're moving first and which ones are moving last. To our example, med ball slam, it's pretty straightforward. You're just picking a med ball up overhead and then you're slamming it on the ground. A lot of people get confused here because they're holding the thing that you're going to be using, you're holding in your arms. So a lot of people tend to think of it as an arm-driven movement. It's not. So the first thing you need to do in any sort of med ball movement and most compound movements is start with the biggest joint that's going to be moving. In this case, it's going to be the hips. So the first thing when you come from this overhead position is you're pulling yourself down to the ground with the hips. If you start pulling yourself down with the hips, you already get the ball moving without moving the arms. So the ball's already traveling down at a certain speed, then you go to the next biggest joint that's going to be used. In this case, it's the shoulders. Once you start moving yourself down in the hips, then it's going to be the elbows being pulled down to the ground. So you want to feel like you're pulling the elbows down to the ground, engaging the lats, using the same muscles you would be if you were doing a pull-up. So it's a pulling movement after you pull yourself down with your hips. So biggest joint hips, second biggest joint shoulders, third one you're going to the elbow, you're going to be extending the arm as you throw that ball down towards the ground. So you get speed from the hips going down, then you get speed from the ball with the elbows being pulled down to the ground, then you finish with the hands throwing down to the floor. You don't want to start the throwing movement with the hands until the elbow has cleared the shoulder on the way down. So you're generating a lot of speed just from these first two parts of the movement without even using your triceps or extending the arms. A lot of people try to start the movement because they think, oh, I'm throwing, I need to start the movement with my hands. That's actually the third thing to move. So just giving an example of that from the side, up overhead to full extension, first hips, then the elbows. Once the elbows come past the shoulders, then you throw the hands to the floor. A med ball slam is a power movement, meaning the speed or the time it takes you to get through the movement, it matters. So the quicker the movement is, the more power you're going to create. So if you're moving yourself down in the right order, hips, shoulders, elbows, then you're going to create the most power possible because you're going to create the most speed of that ball traveling down. Because you start with the hips, then the shoulders, then the elbows, going from the biggest joints down to the smallest, you actually create a whipping effect and you're going to be able to throw with a lot more power than you would if you were to just throw from the arms or the hands from that top position. Last thing to mention, generally speaking, any sort of med ball movement, as you're throwing, that's when you want to be exhaling. You want to stay tight and braced through most of the movement. Once you release the ball, that's when you can release the tension in the body. Holding the breath and staying braced, that'll keep you tight and compact through the entire movement. Once that ball is out of your hands, then you can actually release the tension and breathe, come back overhead, reset yourself all the way up to full extension each time. So next I'm just going to run through basically all my favorite variations of med ball slams. But if you don't understand the sequencing of just the traditional med ball slam, both feet on the ground, slamming down in front of you, then these other ones aren't going to make much sense. So make sure you learn the proper sequencing before you try to do something more advanced by adding instability, by adding a pivot with the feet, anything like that. Make sure you understand the most basic version of the movement first, and then you can go through these other iterations. So I'm not going to give a lot of explanation on the other ones, just because generally speaking, the mechanics are exactly the same. Hips, shoulders, elbows, use that order, exhale as you throw, and it's really hard to mess these things up. As long as you understand the sequencing, we're just adding a slight twist on the movement. That happens sometimes.
We've known each other for so long. Your heart's been aching, but you're too shy to say it. Inside we both know what's been going on. We know the game and we're gonna play it. I just wanna tell you how I'm feeling. Gotta make you understand. I just wanna tell you how I'm feeling. Gotta make you understand. Never gonna give you up. Never gonna let you down. Never gonna run
I'm tired.
down. Desert you. Never gonna make you cry. Never gonna say goodbye. Never gonna tell a lie. Can't hurt you. Never gonna give you up. Never gonna
As we
let
go.
you down. Never gonna run around and desert you. Never gonna make you cry. Never gonna say goodbye. Never gonna tell a lie and hurt you. Hurt you. And hurt you. And hurt you. And hurt
Just up and over, finish in the center. So if you guys actually went through that entire thing and watched the entire video, you can probably see why I started with the first principles. Like, everything's the same. You start with the hips, then the shoulders, then the elbows. So like, that's the sequence of movements you need to be going through to do an effective slam. And that applies to almost any compound movement. Start with the biggest joint, and then you move kind of down the chain to smaller joints. So as long as you understand that first principle sequencing of how to move yourself through these exercises, you know, any sort of med ball slam is going to make sense. It's just a slight variation on what you're doing with your body. Mechanically, it's exactly the same.
you.